Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Politics Lab on YouTube. My name is Bill, and that's Phil. We're political scientists. I teach at North Central College. Phil, you're at Keene State College. They haven't fired you yet, have they?
Not yet.
Not yet. How you doing?
I'm good. I'm tired of the cold weather. I'm ready for spring, but other than that, I'm good.
It hailed snow today. It was very, very unacceptable after being upper 60s last week.
Yeah.
So for this quick YouTube video, we thought we would talk about a piece that David Brooks put out in the New York Times where he talked about Joe Biden as a transformational president. And he argues that with the COVID stimulus bill, that the U.S. government, we are redefining how we understand government. This is not just a stimulus bill. This is redefining how the government works, much more aggressive role, thinking about confronting poverty, that the government has a role in solving our problems, something very different from the era of Ronald Reagan where government was the problem. Really kind of interesting way to think about this, especially in light of, Joe Biden is a centrist. Bernie Sanders was supposed to be the transformational guy. So Phil, is this true? Are we witnessing a transformational moment?
I think it's possible. I think one of the really interesting things in this article is the argument he makes, which is that what we're witnessing is a policy realignment without necessarily a partisan realignment. So it's people have talked about this moment we're in, and all the references to the Lincoln Project and all this other stuff was about are Republicans going to leave the party and become Democrats? Is there going to be this big political realignment? And basically what he's arguing is we're not necessarily seeing that, but what we are seeing is this really significant shift about how everyone across the board views certain policies. Like you said, the role of government in our lives. And I think, first of all, David Brooks is making this argument, right? You have a conservative and he's not complaining about it. He's just acknowledging that this is what's happening. And I think there's some truth to that. The COVID bill, passed. It did not have any Republican support, but but there weren't Republicans. The Republicans weren't putting up an all-out fight about it. They weren't, for the most part, alleging socialism, right? In fact, you've got Mitt Romney and you've got, I think it was Rubio. Is that the other one that he references?
Yeah, Ben Sasse and others, yeah.
Yeah, who are like pushing for, even to go even further on some of these, the child tax credit and some of this other stuff. So, it really does feel like people are thinking differently about government, about the role of government, about particularly in terms of money and that, how much money the government should be spending. I don't know that it's like all that dramatic or revolutionary in like a global context, but when you compare it to the last 40 years of American politics, which was all about small government, reducing taxes, it was all about driving economic growth by essentially lowering taxes, to kind of flip around from this sort of to this kind of demand side, like we're going to give money to people. I think it's pretty ground. It's really shifting the political ground around us.
And it's this subtle, but like you said, dramatic shift. It wasn't as, when Obamacare came through, there was all sorts of discussion and debate about this. Everybody's just kind of on board. And the polling on this, depending on how you ask the question, 60, 70% of the American public likes the stimulus bill. Even some Republicans.
Even Republicans, like 60% of Republicans are on board.
Yeah. And so what's interesting to me is both that the Republicans, I think, see the writing on the wall here and are okay with it. And it's coming out of a Trump administration where deficits didn't matter. So that some of that transition had begun under the Trump administration where it didn't matter. It used to be that we were worried about deficits. Nobody worries about deficits anymore, right? So it's really dramatic but subtle. I think the Republicans are happy to have arguments about culture war. They see that as politically advantageous, so they're willing to go along with these big spending bills. The public is on board. I'm really curious to see how this works, right? Does this have an impact? Are we going to address poverty in a meaningful way? There's even some, you could think about reparations where there's a lot of money tailored for Black farmers, thinking about, pulling African Americans up through poverty. It's totally ambitious.
There's like historical, I don't know. There are analogies you can point back to. Like I'm teaching a European politics class right now, and a big boom in the European sort of welfare state, the role of government in the economy, came after World War II. And it came at this period of time in which like people were tired of essentially crappy economic conditions that came from the war, destruction of industry. And we're not at that point, but we are coming out of this period where we've had multiple, recessions. We're now going through this, year-long lockdown with the pandemic where people are struggling financially. And there is some like historical analogy to say there's a point where people say, we're tired of this not having enough, right? And so you see people across the political spectrum getting on board with it. One of the things that I think is kind of fascinating about this is the role that Joe Biden plays in this, because we were talking right before we started recording about there's this well-known political scientist named Steven Skowronek who talks about I won't go into in depth on it, but he talks about transformational presidents who come along and really kind of shift the way we think about politics and shift these coalitions. And Joe Biden is not he's not it, right? Nobody would have expected Joe Biden to be this. And so I don't know if it's just like perfect timing for him, but I also think he deserves some credit, right? He's both. He has a long history of being kind of a congressional deal maker, right? He knows who he's dealing with. And it's like such a contrast to Trump. There's like no ego in it. Biden's not out there center stage trying to claim credit, which would politicize all of this, right? He's just behind the scenes, like focusing on the policy with this belief that policy is what matters. And I think that approach deserves some of this credit. I think it allows room for this kind of shift to occur, for people to be like, yeah, I'm okay with, a massive stimulus. And let's talk about Dr. Seuss or whatever. And partly him. I think he probably deserves credit for that. What do you think about Biden himself?
I think so. And it's hard to know how much agency he plays. He certainly didn't get in the way. I mean, we could think about going back to Obama. I think there was they were much more cautious. Even Bill Clinton, right? I mean, there was some cautiousness.
Right.
Democrats didn't want to go too big, and Biden has said, let's go big, and they tested the water. Nobody really pushed back. It's easy to do this because it's popular, right? So, even the minimum wage is dramatically popular, even though that got pulled out. All of these initiatives are supportive, and I think the most surprising element is that the Republicans see this and are not pushing harder. I mean, they made, like you said, they made some socialist arguments, but not many of them. And it does feel like conversations about debt and the role of government may be different from this point moving forward, even for Republican administrations. It's not possible to think about this in the 80s when Thatcher and Reagan were saying we got to cut government. Now we're really thinking about government solving problems. It's so different. And even the Fed, the Federal Reserve, which is oftentimes so worried about inflation, so worried about your economy getting overcooked. And they're saying, keep throwing more money at this problem. What we need to do is get the economy going. So history will tell whether this was a good course of action or not, but you're right. It is dramatic to watch.
It is really across the board at all, upper levels of political elites, across political parties, all sorts of, it's top to bottom, all parties, everything. All of which raises the question of why it makes it even more bizarre to me that Republicans didn't go all in with something like this, back in September, October, in the lead up to the election. I wonder if they had put out some sort of massive package that involved stimulus, that involved, child tax credits, that involved, all of this extended unemployment, it makes you wonder about how the election might have gone. Maybe the loss is part of what has gotten them on board with, we're going to move forward with this because, fighting it is not popular. But yeah, go ahead.
You've had some situations where Republicans who voted against the bill are taking credit for it, right? Which is a really curious thing. Like, I know I have to vote against it, but with my local constituents, I want to be, drawing attention to those things that I liked. It's such a curious
Look what we in Congress did for you that I voted against. Yeah.
Well, and infrastructure is coming next probably. So that's going to be a dramatic thing. And if we'll see whether this norm holds, or what I should say, right, whether this new conception of government holds. So if
it starts the ball rolling, that'll be interesting to see. Yeah,
exactly. Well, we should wrap up. Follow us on the YouTube and tune in for the podcast next week. All right. See you, Phil.
Bye, Bill.